All right. Hey, everybody. Susan, I'm sorry for not posting this earlier, but here we are. So, for our spiritual conference today, we moved adoration to Thursday instead of Friday this week because of the feast of St. John Paul the Great, our school's patron. So, we are going to look at a question that several people have asked me. How do we know that the Bible that we have today says what it did originally? How do we know it hasn't been changed and altered in some big ways? That's a fair question, and it relates to the spiritual life because we've been doing Lectio Divina, which of course uses the Bible as the basis for our prayer. So it's important, if we're going to pray with the Bible and treat it as the Word of God, we need to know whether or not we can trust it. Okay, so this is going to be an introduction to what's called textual criticism. Now, if you haven't watched this video already, pause this video, close out, pull up the slideshow, and watch this video because it gives a pretty good introduction, at least the first 5 minutes of it. Watch that, and then we'll come back here. So I'll move on, assuming you've watched it so far. What is textual criticism? Okay, it's the effort basically to scientifically figure out what the Bible originally said. Okay, so we don't have the original copies of the books of the Bible. I don't know why I have 2 commas there, typo. Okay, but the autographs are what we use to refer to the original copies. So we don't have the original Gospel of Matthew as it was written by Matthew. We don't have the original Gospel of John as it came out of John's hand. Okay. What we do have are a bunch of manuscripts, which are handwritten copies of those originals. Okay. And of course, over time, you do get some errors that pop into those. So scribes, as you'll hear in the video, scribes will sometimes just make typos, typographical errors. They might misread a word as they're copying it. One scribe might write a note in the margins to clarify something that's not clear in the biblical text. And then another scribe later on might accidentally or intentionally include that note within the biblical text itself, thinking that it's like something that needs to be inserted in there. Okay, so over time, then, words and phrases, even chunks of text, sometimes got added into the text of the Bible. Okay, so how do we figure out what the Bible originally said? Well, we have to compare all of these manuscripts to each other, and especially the most ancient ones. Okay, so there's a couple of basic principles to this. All right, there's more than this, but here are a couple of important ones. Number one, older manuscripts are generally closer to the original than more recent ones or later manuscripts. So a copy of the Gospel of John that comes from the 4th century, we're going to assume is probably closer to the original Gospel than a copy that came from the 10th century, unless there's evidence that shows otherwise, okay? Which may or may not exist, okay? But just as a basic rule, older manuscripts are generally going to be closer to the original because those errors pile up over time. Okay. Also, readings found in manuscripts from different geographical areas are generally more reliable as well. So, in the ancient world, of course, you don't have phones, you don't have email. So, a scribe in Alexandria, Egypt, is going to have no contact, generally speaking, with a scribe in Jerusalem or Antioch or Rome or Gaul, which is modern day France. Okay. So the scribes in Alexandria, Egypt are going to be working from their original copy, more or less independently from the guys in Jerusalem who are going to be working with the original copy. And the guys in France are going to be working with their own original copies, completely independently of everybody else. So if the texts, the manuscripts from France and Alexandria, Egypt, and Jerusalem and Rome all read the same way, that's a pretty darn good argument to say that's what the document originally said. Okay. So to use an analogy here, what we could do is we could have students in my classroom start with an original text, okay, just whatever, a paragraph. Have one student copy that paragraph, typing or writing, then they pass their copy on to somebody else. That next student then makes another copy of the first student's copy, and then another person makes a copy of the second student's copy. somebody else makes a copy of the third student's copy, and so on. Over time, you're going to have some typos in there. People might misread words, or they might skip words accidentally, or whatever might be the case. Okay. So let's say by the time all 20 people in my class have made a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, we will end up with a final text that looks a little bit different. There are minor errors or changes from the original paragraph that we started with. If we took that same paragraph and did the same thing with a different set of students in Miss Hippel's room, which is right next to mine, okay, they did the same process there, they would also end up with some errors in theirs, okay? But they would probably end up being different errors. So we might have words X, Y, and Z that got added or taken out or misspelled. They then might have words A, B, and C that were added or taken out or misspelled. So we've got different sets of errors. And if you compared the two final paragraphs from my room and her room, then you could identify where they disagree. Okay. So mine ends up saying yada, yada, yada. Hers says yuda, yuda, yuda in these certain spots. And so we can say, well, obviously they disagree on these points, but by comparing them, we might be able to figure out what the original actually said. And if you had that with John Pohl's class, and they did the same thing, and then you did that with Brian Spitzley's class, and so we ended up with all of these different manuscript families, okay, these different final products from different places with different scribes. Then we can compare all of them and say, well, here's where they disagree, here's where they agree. Where they all agree, then we can be pretty darn sure that's what the original said. Where they disagree then is where you get into some more nitpicky kinds of details, okay? That's more or less the process of textual criticism, all right? And you have what are called manuscript families. So the manuscripts or the copies that came out of my classroom would be like the Vandenberg manuscript family. Miss Hippel would have the Hippel manuscript family, and so on. And so the scribes have no contact with each other, but all be working from the same originals. Okay, and you could use that. All right, so hopefully you get that from that analogy, which would kind of be an interesting experiment, actually. I would like to do that. Anyway, okay, here's a chart comparing ancient manuscripts from different ancient documents. Okay, you can see up here Plato's Republic, very important philosophical work. He wrote this around 375 BC. We have 7 early manuscripts. Okay, only 7 of these. That doesn't include fragments, all right? But 7 complete or partial manuscripts, and the earliest complete copy comes from the 9th century AD. That's the 800s AD. Okay, that's 1,300 years after Plato wrote it. So Plato wrote this thing, and the first copy we have of it is from 1,300 years later, and we only have 7 of those to compare. Okay, so they do have to do textual criticism on Plato's Republic and all of these ancient works. They just don't have that much to work with. Yet nobody questions that Plato's Republic, as we have it now, is substantially the same thing that he wrote originally. Same thing with Aristotle or any of these other guys. Tacitus, who's a Roman historian. Okay, his Annals, written around 110 AD. Earliest complete copy, the 1000s. Okay, so 1,000 years after he wrote it, and we only have 34 early complete or partial manuscripts to compare. Now compare that to the New Testament, okay, written in the 1st century, as we've discussed. Earliest complete copy we have is from the 300s, so only about 350 years. And we have 263 Greek copies of the New Testament from prior to the 9th century. Okay, so compare that to these. We have a ridiculous wealth of Greek manuscripts, which is the original language is written in, from much earlier than any of these other documents. Okay, which means that we have a lot more to compare. We have a lot more data, and that makes it easy for us, relatively easy for us to know what the original biblical text actually said, okay, for the New Testament. So there's way better manuscript evidence for the New Testament and the reliability of that than any other ancient historical document, okay? All right, so big number at the end here. Scholars estimate that as much as 98% of the New Testament especially is certain, okay? we can be certain that about 98% of it is as it was originally, okay, based on the current manuscript evidence. And we're always finding more manuscripts, okay? All right, so 98% is pretty good. Now, the other 2%, we recognize that there's some ambiguity. It's not always clear what the original reading was. So if you look at a modern translation, you can look at the footnotes. They'll have what are called textual notes. So we'll look at this verse here. This is John 17:12 in the New Revised Standard Version Catholic Edition. It says, "While I was with them, I protected them in your name that you have given me." Okay, textual note here. So B, the footnote says, other ancient authorities read, "protected in your name those whom." Okay, so there are two different manuscript traditions here. Some manuscripts say this, other manuscripts say that, more or less. Now, that's not a major difference, but it's a difference. So a lot of these modern biblical translations will include notes where there are discrepancies in the manuscripts. Okay. All right, so I hope that's helpful. Okay. Basically, the takeaway is that from a purely scholarly perspective, a lot of these guys are not actual practicing Christians either. The New Testament is very historically reliable. We have a very high degree of certainty as to what the original text said. All right. All right. Well, I will be back tomorrow with a video lecture continuing our current unit, but I hope that that's helpful.